to know each other through a couple of events that she attended. And also I went to visit her just not too shortly before she passed away in Baltimore. Do you ever see a face that you just like? Just somebody, and I find this particularly true with older people. I just like older people. I speak as a very young man. And I particularly like Joyce. And so when I was invited to give the first shear for the Yorkshire, I thought I could just give a shear. Or I thought perhaps we could meld, weave Joyce's life into some profound Torah ideas. When I was a young man, I spent 3 months living in Paris, in France. And of course, if you are going to be in Paris, there are certain things that you have to go and visit. If you visit Memphis, Tennessee, as I did, then of course you got to go and visit Graceland. And today I went to visit Graceland, which was overwhelming. And it was, you know, there's certain things you have to go to. And so I went to Graceland. We didn't go in, but I went to the outside so I could have my picture taken. When I was a young man and I lived in Paris, of course you've got to go and see the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre. And you've got to go and see the Louvre. So I went to the Louvre, which I still think is the largest art gallery in the world, if I remember correctly. And I went into the Louvre, and something, as a young man, I think I was 16, struck me as very unusual. There were young artists sitting in front of some of the greatest works of art, the most famous works of art in the world, painting them. So they were sitting in front of the Mona Lisa or various other works by Da Vinci or other famous artists, painting and copying in meticulous detail the paintings that were on the wall. And I remember, because I was only 16, being completely puzzled by this. What's the point of painting something that's already there? I mean, you can take a picture, and it's already there, so what's the point of sitting there for days at a time, copying in minute detail what's already there? And then somebody explained to me what these young art students were doing. Were trying to discover the technique of the master. How he directed his brush. How thick to make the paint. What direction was the brush stroke, down or up? And of course the general construction of the painting itself. That was what the artists were doing. Of course, there are different eras, different periods of art. There's the medieval period, the Renaissance period. There is the Impressionist period, the Expressionist period, surreal, abstract. Somebody called Shlomo Volda, in his beautiful Sefer Ali Shur, says, unless you understand where a person lived and when a person lived, you will never be able to understand the person. We are, after all, only the product of our time and our place. That's where Hashem sent us to. And Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, the great leader of German Jewry, he writes in his Chorev, and the Chorev is a work which goes through all of the 613 mitzvahs, giving a philosophical explanation behind it. If you look in the chapter which talks about the statutes, then he comes to the mitzvah of avoiding sexual immorality. I can't remember precisely, maybe some of the rabbis of the Kala will remind me now, when Chorev was published, I think 1812, round about then. But he writes there, parents, don't forget that the moral degradation began when you were young. Be careful about your children. Guard who comes into the house. Know that this particular sin of immorality starts when a child is 9, 10, and 11. And he goes on at great length. And when I first saw this, I thought it very funny. What did you see on the streets of Frankfurt and Main? Round about 1817, 1812. And if he's talking to the parents then, we're talking about people who lived in 1780. Or 1790, when women wore skirts down to their ankles and their collars came to their chins. What did you see? consider that to be a challenging time from the point of view of morality or immorality. What would Reb Shimshon Full Hirsch make if he was looking at our world and our time? And maybe that's the reason why apparently when we go upstairs to have our lives judged and we sit in front of the Bet Din Shomala, the heavenly court, who is it that constitutes the heavenly court that judges and assesses our performance in our lives? And I've seen it in several Jewish books. The great rabbis of your time, of our time. Because the rabbis of our time understand the challenges of our time. Rav Shamshon Full Hirsch, if you were to take the hard drive out of Y.Y. Rubinstein's head and put it into a computer and show the images that are there to Rav Shamshon Full Hirsch, he would not consider me to be a very good Jew. But I didn't do anything wrong, well, sometimes, but I'm simply walking down the street in our world and seeing billboards with, well, you can imagine sort of things, that pictures in my mind, he would say I'm some sort of corrupt individual. No, I was just a Jew walking to yeshiva one day when there was a billboard of this lady not wearing too much or whatever it was. The tests of your time define who and what you are. If that's true, then I think that we'd have to consider all the elements that went into the picture that made up Joyce's life. Every brushstroke, every element to see it. And of course, we don't have time. How can you reconstruct somebody's life? But maybe the main thrust of the painting, of the work we can get a taste of, and the period that it was painted in, which of course is 1928. 1928 was a challenging time for Jews in the United States of America. The most wonderful introduction I know to Judaism, and I've always been jealous. It was one of my great ambitions in life, that Herman Wout's wonderful book, This Is My God, that I would one day write a book better than Herman Wout's This Is My God. Surely I could make a better introduction. Well, I'm on my 12th book at the moment, and I've never come anywhere near equaling Herman Wout's book, This Is My God. He beautifully explains the challenge that faced American Jews round about 1928. He talks about the Cheder system. It's a very interesting thing. Wherever I go in the world, I ask, you do that sort of thing when you're asking for a reaction, word association, black, white, or what comes into your mind if I say this. I sometimes ask Jewish audiences, what emotion, what feeling, what reaction do you have if I say the word cheder? And usually people go, ugh. And certainly in This Is My God, Herman Wout points out that the cheder was probably the death blow of American Jews. The death blow for American Jews. They came over from their Heim. They were the children in 1928 and the grandchildren of people who came here. They had to go to public school. The public school was beautifully appointed with teachers who were qualified, with nice books. After school, they had to go to cheder. The cheder, he writes, was usually taught by a failed melamed, somebody who was frustrated with his lot in life, so very quick to offer reproof or correction on the back of his hand, slapping a kid, with books that were tattered and swearing that were falling to bits. He writes, I can't remember verbatim what he wrote, but the theme was, the general thrust of his argument was, the contrast between the two could not have been greater, and people fled Judaism in their tens of thousands. 1928 was a time when Jews fled. This was the Golden Medina. Wow, this is fantastic. But Joyce's family were not fleers. They did not flee. And that's quite interesting. That was quite a challenging time. One of the great commentators in the Torah, somebody called Rabbeinu Bachaya. Rabbeinu Bachaya says an incredibly interesting thing. Before you and I were born, when we were up there in heaven, then Hashem tells us precisely and exactly what our lives are going to be. Interesting idea. How long we will live, the challenges of that life, who we will marry, and eventually when that life will end and we'll go back upstairs, and how it will end. That's what Rabbeinu Bechaya says. But I found recently something which got me incredibly excited. There is a Sephardi Kabbalist, or was a Sephardi Kabbalist, going back to the 16th century or so. It's called the Patina, Italian Kabbalist. And he says it slightly differently. The Patina says that before you and I were born, we were taken, he says, into what looks, I suppose, like a room. For ladies, it was full of dresses. For men, it was full of suits. And you got to choose. This was to be your life. You chose the life. It's a nice suit with a label on it, what's going into the suit, what's going to happen, and you chose your life. That means Joyce chose her life. And you were going to put on that suit at a certain time in 1928, but she and us would not have chosen this life unless we could have succeeded in this life. Indeed, 1928 was a challenging time, but so is 2019. The challenges that we face in our lives were challenges we chose to face because we knew we could beat them. We wouldn't be here celebrating this life at this time, in a Beis HaMedrash, in a yeshiva, being that sort of Jew unless we had chosen it because we knew, whether we live in Memphis or New York or Israel or wherever, that we could do the job. Doesn't mean to say it's going to be easy, quite the converse. It might be very difficult. And when she was 26 years of age, Joyce had a friend. She grew up in New York in a place called Crown Heights, which you may be aware of, center of the Lubavitch movement. How should I put this? I have a theory. I don't know if you know any Lubavitchers. I've got lots of Lubavitch friends. I have a theory. You know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe came up with the Uferatster campaign. Are you familiar with the Uferat? Spread out. Spread Yiddishkeit, spread Hasidus all through the world. I have a different theory. I think the great Lubavitcher Rebbe's affection and love for his Hasidim led him in part to launch the campaign so that his Hasidim could be freed from Brooklyn. This is my theory. And we lived there for 4 years. We got out for good behavior. So I know what I'm talking about. Brooklyn is a challenging place. And Joyce had a good friend who'd already come to a place called Memphis, Tennessee. And she had the idea for her to meet somebody, a fellow. And she set them up. But what I heard from Ann Ellen, which really got me very excited, was how they met. They couldn't do Skype. Even telephones were not so easy. I'm not sure if that's how they communicated. Ann Ellen said they communicated by letter. They got to know each other by letter. That got me so excited. Now, I'll tell you why I got very excited about this idea. Anyone here tonight who is romantic by nature? Oh, that's some ladies, okay. Any of the ladies who are nodding, you're not romantic? Okay, sorry, it's okay, that's fair enough, okay. I don't know who your husband is, don't look. Does anybody here believe in love at first sight? Okay, you do. I'll take just a few seconds to demonstrate there is no such thing as love at first sight. You may be familiar, I'm sure Joyce was, with the famous, I don't know where it comes from, probably some movie, but there's a famous song which goes something like, "Some enchanted evening, you may see a stranger." Remember how this goes?
Yeah.
You may see a stranger across a crowded room, and somehow you know. You know even then, no you don't! This is insanity! You look across the room and you know even then that you love this person! Are you off your head? What is that person like? You may be attracted, she may be beautiful, you may, desire her, but to love her? What's she like? The Gemara in Megillah says, in New Gimel, there was 3 most beautiful women in the world. The 3 most beautiful women in the world, anybody know? So the Kolo rabbis all start showing off. He's just causing trouble. In the right, I want it in the right order. Sorry, Maynard, yes. Abigail. Esther. To which the Gemara says, Esther, as they say in Latin, but I tell you, don't be ridiculous. The Gemara says she had a green hue. She doesn't look so pretty. The Gemara seems to back up. Okay, fair enough. In that case, we'll replace Esther with Vashti. Vashti. Vashti, Adolf Haman's wife. As evil as Haman was, a precursor of Hitler, Yamach Shemoy, then Haman was that precursor, but his wife was worse. But if you walked in here, a man walked in here and she was, and Vashti was taking his arm, the guys might go, wow, how did he manage to be the most beautiful woman in history, number 3? But what was she inside? What sort of person was she in the inside? It's a beautiful story my brother-in-law told me. He used to live in Bayat Began. There's a lady living in Bayat Began. I'm not sure the name of the condition. She's extremely brilliant. She is an academic. She is wheelchair bound. And there was an American PhD student who wanted to do research in her field. He wrote to her asking if she would help him in this field, and she can't write herself, but our assistant wrote back and said yes, she'd be willing to help him. And this fellow came actually from New York, Jewish by coincidence, handsome big fellow, and this lady in the wheelchair, she's got a condition, she can't control the movement of her body and her hands all over the place, shakes them. Anyway, he spent over 10 months with research, with her input. He completed his research. It was time for him to come back to America, and people noticed that he wasn't coming back to America. He kept visiting this lady with a terrible inability to control her movements in the wheelchair, and one day they were discussing whatever this topic was, astrophysics, mathematics, I can't even remember now, and suddenly he changed the topic and he said, will you marry me? Will you marry me? And she managed to point at herself and said, why would you want to marry this? And he said, I'm interested in what's inside this. I'm interested in what's inside this. And as Anne Ellen pointed out when she was showing me a collection of photographs, some of which you perhaps saw on the screen a few moments ago, that her mother was, as a young woman, a very beautiful woman. And when I saw the picture, it was obvious to me that her father was an extremely handsome fellow. And I thought to myself, it's a good job that they met each other in the form of a correspondence first. Because had they met each other in the normal way of human beings, any man would have been blown away by this beautiful young woman, any young woman would have been blown away by this incredibly handsome fellow, and maybe not have persevered to see what's inside that external beauty, which indeed was something very special. That's what, in a beautiful old-fashioned way, she got to see in her chosin before she got to see the chosin. And when they saw each other, I suppose that was pretty easy that they were going to get married, and indeed they did. And then they went to Dixie. Came down south, and they lived here. And Ellen told me that when she came here, it was a very lonely experience. 26, 27, and come to a whole new town, and you come from Brooklyn, and you come to a place where people speak totally differently, Brooklyn. And it's, a challenge. And she didn't know anybody. So what do you do when you find a challenge? You come to a complete place where you're completely unknown and you don't know anybody. Well, I remember I was once giving a talk in San Diego, and I met there a Holocaust survivor, a remarkable man. He'd been in Auschwitz, and I was asked to give a talk. I gave a talk entitled "Why the Very Bad Things Happen to Very Good People." And he came up to me afterwards to say that he was supposed to be speaking the next day at Charlotte Shooters, and I'd taken away everything he wanted to say. But I wanted to hear what an Auschwitz survivor would have to say on the topic of why did very bad things happen to very good people. It's quite amazing. He said that one day, there was 400 people, I think, who come to hear him. One day, he said, a bunch of us boys were standing at the corner of a barracks within sight of the chimneys of the crematorium. And one of the boys says, I'm happy I'm in Auschwitz. I'm happy I'm in Auschwitz. We looked at him and he said, what? You're crazy. You're a sugar. You're nuts. You're happy you're in Auschwitz. No, I'm not a sugar. And if I wasn't happy, so where should I be? Still in Auschwitz. I was utterly blown away by that. To be able to actually turn that, wow, and then he turned to this audience. He said, the Gemara famously says, there was a guy called Nochem Ish Gamzu. And Nochem Ish Gamzu always used to say, and then he paused, and many people turned around and said, Gamzu L'Torah. And Gamzu L'Torah means, this will also be good. He said, you know how you read that Gemara? Gamzu L'Torah. I'll make that good. Then he turned to this audience and said, if you haven't suffered, you haven't lived. You haven't suffered. You're nothing. Because how else are you going to help other people when they're suffering? Wow. I'll make it good. These are two themes that really echoed when I was hearing the life story of the woman we're honoring tonight. Because she came here and she knew nobody. So what are you going to do? Sit at home and cry? See a therapist? Or do something about it? So she got involved with the local show. And she volunteered for volunteering is a big word in Joyce's life. Volunteered with a local show, and then eventually with a local school. And then she made friends. But it's this idea of, if you haven't gone through tough times yourself, how are you going to help other people going through tough times? If you don't know what it's like to go through tough times. It's a concept which is called Nosa Ba'oil im Chaverim. You've got to feel somebody's pain as though it's your own pain. If you want to really interact with other people, then it's got to be taking on as though it's yours. I remember when I was in Carlo, I was 7 years in a yeshiva called Gateshead. Have you all heard of Gateshead? Yeah, some yes, some no. You've all heard of Lakewood. Right. Well, what Lakewood is to America, Gateshead is to Europe. In fact, in Gateshead, we think Lakewood is reform. You know, I cracked that joke in Lakewood 2 years ago. Didn't be invited back. But I was in Carlo there, and part of the job you had to go collecting funds for the Carlo, which is actually a very healthy thing to do. You got to know that money doesn't grow in trees. And so I was in New York for a week, Chicago for a week, and then in Los Angeles. And when I came to Chicago, nobody had prepared me for the fact that January in Chicago can be a very challenging time. I mean, I did know that it had a nickname called the Windy City. If you combine wind with sub-zero temperatures, it's quite challenging. And I remember my driver, there's a driver who knows where everybody is, who are the philanthropists, who's going to give the money, and he took me to the house and he said, this fellow will give you $50. I went to the front door. You had to climb over the great piles of snow. I got to the front door. I was absolutely freezing. And I rang the doorbell, and after 2 rings, the door opened. There was a lady standing there who looked even colder than the snow. Yes, she said to me. I said, oh, my name's Rabbi Rubinstein. I'm in Liverpool, Carlo. Nobody's been paid for the last 6 months. I wondered if I could see, can't remember the name of the husband, Mr. Cohen. He said, do you have an appointment? I said, no. He won't see it. I said, could I make an appointment? No. So, and at this point, my English accent was falling away fast. And I said, look, I've come all the way from England, and I'm absolutely frozen. Do you think you could just ask him? So she looked at me and she said, stay there. Stay there. Build an igloo. And off she went. And she called her husband. He was upstairs, and then she turned, oh, come in, she said. So I came in, I could have crawled in, I was feeling so small. She called up the stairs to her husband, David! David! And I said, yeah, what is it? Somebody here to see you. Who is it? I don't know, some guy collecting. Tell the bum I won't see him, came the voice from the top of the stairs. I did not feel good, although she gave me $50. But I have to tell you, the posuk says in Mishpatim, Im kesef salve esami, if you lend my people money, says God to the Jewish people, hese oni imoch, the poor person with you, then it goes on to say you mustn't charge interest, etc. Rashi says, why did it say the poor person with you? Rashi says, Istakel ba'atzmecha ki'ilu ata oni. Imagine you're the poor person. If you want to do the mitzvah of chesed properly, you've got to see yourself as though you're the person standing at the door, freezing. And then your reaction and then your welcome is going to be totally different. Then you'll see it as being a different thing altogether. When Moshe Rabbeinu is up to Mount Sinai to get the Torah, he sees Hashem and he's sitting in his throne, and underneath there is a floor which is made of sapphire bricks. Rashi said, what's that about? It was to remind God that all the time that the Jews were in Egypt, they were enslaved and they had to make structures for Pharaoh out of bricks. The bricks and the floor were to remind God of the fact that Jews were enslaved in a very harsh regime, building stuff with bricks. Now there is a problem with that. I'm sure you can figure it out. What's the problem? God doesn't need any reminding. He doesn't need an alarm. Oh, I forgot. He doesn't forget anything. So what does it mean that the bricks were there to remind God of our situation? God doesn't need a reminder, but Moshe had to be shown that if you want to understand other people's situation, you've got to picture it. You have to have a picture in your mind. But you can only have a picture in your mind if you know what a picture is. If you've been in that situation yourself. And it's funny because I was talking to somebody just earlier today, sadly I had to leave a little bit early, Hal. He said when he first came to this town, then the person, the home that was the most welcoming, that wanted him to come, where he found his first open door and big white smile, was the home of the lady who we're honouring tonight. Because she knew what it was like to come to a town and not know anybody, and struggle, at least initially, to make friends, and to take this bits of noise of oil of Chavero, taking somebody else's situation and their difficulties and turning it into something positive. Gamzu, I'm going to make that into something good. That's a remarkable quality to have. To help other people. And you know, when I was in London once, I was going down to London. I was living still in Manchester in England. I'm down to London. And I made an enormous mistake. I left my hat at home in Manchester. And I was saying, Sherry, now, as you know, as an ultra-Orthodox Jew, I mean, you just don't qualify as a rabbi unless you have a hat. So what was I going to do? So I asked my family, I was living in a place called Golders Green, and where's the best place to get a hat? Another area called Stamford Hill, which is about a half-hour, 40-minute drive. So I phoned the place where the hats were to be found, and a little Hasidic fellow picked up the phone, and I said, I'm looking for a Borsalino, of course. And what size? Said a quarter. Would you have such a hat? And he said, yes. I said, I'll be over in 40 minutes. Came to the door was bolted. It's a very bad area of town. He'd been mugged apparently a couple of times. Pulled back the bolt, he took me in, bolted the door again. He said, you're the fellow who phoned? I said, yes. He said, come in. And he pulled out a whole pile of Borsalino hats. Put them down. Then he said to me, willst du haben a glass tea? Would you like to have a cup of tea? Or maybe a cup of coffee? I said, I don't want to trouble you. Let me make you a cup of coffee. I said, please, Rabbiit, he said. Let me make you a cup of coffee. Okay. Went into the back of the store. He comes back a minute later with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. The first hat he showed me was perfect. And then we started to schmooze. Or as he was a Hasidic Jew, I should say we started to schmeeze. And he said, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm in the religion business. And then he started to talk about himself. And he and his wife had had a little baby boy about 8 years previously. And this little baby boy had been born with everything wrong that a child could possibly have when it was born. The child was born blind. The child was also born paralyzed. Well, the sinews, I don't know the name of the condition again, but the sinews that stretched like an elastic band to allow movement, contraction, expansion of limbs, instead of being elastic and supple, they were rigid. The child was born paralyzed. This was as bad as it could be. They went to see surgeons, and the surgeons said they could help, but it would mean, really, a childhood of surgery. One surgery after the other. You can cut a zigzag. Think of the Achilles tendon. It's like a ribbon. Cut a zigzag, and it can stretch. We'd have to have lots of such operations. This would not take place until the child was about 3 years of age. And when the child was 2, there was a doctor who came, who practiced alternative medicine. He was a Japanese doctor based in Chile, in South America, in Santiago. And apparently he had specialities in this field, and somebody said you should go and see him. So he went. He said, I'm only in town for 2 weeks, but we'll start. If you see success, then you'll come to Chile. And after 2 weeks, they could see progress. They decided they were going to go to Chile. The doctor went back to Chile. And then the little Hasidic hat salesman went to get 2 tickets or 3 tickets to Chile. And of course, a little Hasidic hat salesman goes to a little Hasidic travel agent to get his tickets. So he explained what he's looking for. 3 tickets to Chile. And his friend said, Bisti Michigan? Are you off your head? Chile? Michigan Gansen? What are you going to do about kosher food? What are you going to do about Shabbos? They kidnap people off the streets in Chile. You mad? Weren't going to go to Chile. And that was that. And so they just waited for the first of the many surgeries, predicted surgeries for his child. But 6 months later, he got a phone call just like mine. And the phone call was from a Rosh Hashiva from Israel, who was there collecting in London, and he had also come without a hat. And so he arrived at the fellow's store, he pulled back the bolts, they took him in, and he bolted the door, he brings out the hats, the sort of Rosh Hashiva hats, called Homburg hats. He puts them there and he says to him, would you like a cup of coffee? And he says, okay. And he comes out with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. He likes making coffee, this little Hasidic Jew. And so he says to the Rosh Hashiva, what brings you to London? He's collecting for his yeshiva. Forgive me asking, how come you come without a hat? He said, well, I'll tell you the truth. The taxi came late, and when the taxi came late, I rushed out. With my cases, it was touch and go, and I'd get the plane in time, and I left my hat. I didn't have time to go back for it. Oh, fine. He said, and after London, you go back to Israel? I said, no, I'm going to New York, collecting in New York. And then going to, no, after that I'm going to South America. South America? Where? Chile. There are frum Jews in Chile? Of course. And he told them the story of his son. I said, no problem, give me the phone. So he took out his little notebook with all the addresses of his victims. And he makes a phone call to somebody. He explains the situation. Bill says, no problem, he can stay in our basement. Send him and his wife and his kid, no problem whatsoever. Spent 6 months there. When he came back with his child, it was the week before the scheduled operation. The doctor wanted to see the child before the operation, and when the surgeon saw the child, he said, why is this child here? He doesn't need to see me. The progress was amazing and remarkable. So I don't know what this doctor does in Chile, but keep going to him. And he said to me, and do you know why? He said, because I think that this Rosh Hashiva thinks the reason he came to see me was because the taxi was late. I think Hashem made the taxi late so that I would come to my store because he'd left his hat, which he couldn't go back from, and I would hear that there were frum Jews in Chile. And I think he's right. But I also think that he heard that because he made him a cup of coffee. The chesed of a cup of coffee. What is the chesed of a cup of coffee? It's absolutely nothing. And yet the chesed of 1 cup of coffee saved his child from all that pain. And when, as we heard before, Joyce's house was open to so much hospitality, and so many young people in this community would make that a centre on Shabbos or during the week to come and meet each other across a crowded room, etc., etc. And so many couples came from that. But how much schar, how much reward do you think is generated by a lifetime of chesed? It must be enormous. It must literally be enormous. And as Anne Ellen, as our daughter just said a few seconds ago, when she went, not too many years ago, to Baltimore, this very old lady decided that she would volunteer, because she likes volunteering, to help old ladies and old gentlemen in Baltimore. And that apartment, where I visited her the last time I saw her, was the center of a hub of social life, just like their home had been here in Memphis. But that exact same person brought the exact same smiles and the exact same warmth. The Hanukkah parties were in her apartment, and the Purim parties were in her apartment. Everything was there. All those old folk in these apartments up there in Baltimore are literally bereft a year later, because their social secretary, the person who was the hub of bringing their joy and happiness in their old age, is no longer there. What sort of reward do you get in Shemayim for a lifetime, nearly 90 years, of chesed, of bringing smiles and laughter to other people? It must be absolutely enormous. And you all know the famous Gemara says that if somebody's sick and you go to visit them, then you take away a 60th of their illness. Are you familiar with this famous teaching? But people forget to add on. The Gemara says, no, it's not anybody who goes to visit a sick person. The person who takes away a 60th of somebody's illness has to be what's called a ben gilui. That is to say, if it's a rich person who's sick, if it's a rich person visiting a rich person, then they take away a 60th of the illness. If it's an old person visiting an old person, or a young person visiting a young person, then they take away a 60th of the illness. Why? Because for whatever reasons beyond the remit of this talk, they've decided in heaven that a person should have X amount of suffering. That means X, not X plus 1 or X minus 1. X amount of suffering. But if you go there and you are a ben gilui, well, what do you think a rich person visiting a rich person who's lying there very sick is going to say to themselves? Or a young person visiting a young person? Or an old person visiting an old person? What are they going to say to themselves when they're visiting such a person? It could be me. It could be me. 4 words. And because you see it, it could be you. It upsets you. And you take away a bit of the pain that was given to them. Because you feel for them. And you see as though you are them. Is the difference between those two very commonly connected English words, sympathy and empathy. They both come from the Greek word pathos, meaning to feel. But sympathy means I feel sorry for you. But empathy is I feel I am you. And when Joyce came here and started the whole new community, she experienced that. And she was able to project that onto other people. And when she's an old person, then of course she's a ben or a bas gilui to all those other old people. And brought so much happiness to them. Nearly at the end. Yehuda, Yaakov's son Yehuda, is the son who was designated to be the royal household, to found the royal household of Klal Yisrael. Why? Because he had a particular Jewish characteristic. The characteristic was something called Hoidah. Hoidah is a willingness to accept that it's not all about you, it doesn't all come from you. Where did he get this characteristic from? This is an essential characteristic for a king. You all know the phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There is nobody who needs to be able to see that it's all me than a king, or being a king will corrupt you. Where did Yehuda get the koyach, get this energy of Hoidah from? His mother. His mother. Because there were Yaakov's 4 wives. I have to tell you, incidentally, I've never understood even as an Orthodox, fully qualified rabbi, the concept of polygamy in the Torah. After all, more than one wife means more than one mother-in-law. However, Yaakov Avinu has 4 wives, and they're all prophetesses. That means that each and every one of them could assume that they are going to be the mother of how many children? As they know he's going to have 12? 3. And when Leah has her 4th son, she called him Yehuda to give Haidah, to give thanks to God, because I know it comes from you. So what did he do? What did Yehuda do to make him so special? All he did was to inherit a quality from his parent. We all get qualities from our parents. We get our looks from our parents. We get our gifts from our parents. And very often we get our personalities and our temperaments from our parents as well. So what did Yehuda do? And the answer is, you take the best thing from your parent. And even though so often through the teenage rebellion you want to reject it, he didn't. He took the best things from his mother and he developed that. And everything else that he became came from that starting point. So there's somebody called Rabbi Yerucham from there. I think we are celebrating tonight a life and a person that her children can be so grateful that they've got so much to have used, to be able to use from her life as the starting point, or we're able to use from her life as the starting point of their lives. And to take chesed, a feeling for other people, a quality to look into somebody, not just at the outside. All the things we talked about tonight, this is a fabulous starting point. You see, you only get to see the painting when it's finished. You can have a work of art, but if you come into Leonardo da Vinci's studio in the middle when he's rendering the Mona Lisa, and incidentally he painted it 3 times, but when he's rendering a great work of art, you can look at it and you can see the sketch at the beginning on the canvas, or maybe when he's just started to paint it, you don't know how it's going to turn out. You only see if a work of art is going to be a masterpiece when it's finished. It's only the end, when you can stand back, perhaps a year later, and look back and say, that was pretty good. And Joyce's canvas was coloured with all sorts of vivid, bright colours. It was gorgeous blues. That was sort of the Jewish values that she got at a time when everybody was running away from them and giving them up and abandoning Judaism in huge numbers. As Herman Wout said, people left in their tens of thousands, but not her family. So it was a blue. Blue is a Jewish colour. So there'll be a lot of blue there. And there's lots of white there as well. I think the white was the chesed. And then so much else, so many other vivid colours of a life that was painted, and you could see the brushstrokes. Now we can look like those artists in the Louvre, young artists who could stand and copy that. That's how they did that, yeah. And then eventually, that was why it's a masterpiece. Maybe I could copy that as well. Maybe I could absorb that technique. And then you stand back a year later, and you look at it and you go, now that it's finished, now that the painting has been rendered, now that the paint's dried, then you get to look at this. I think it's obvious to me that the best thing, so many people have come here tonight, and it's such a tribute to this family, to Joyce's children and grandchildren, that you've all come here. That's a sign that everything I've told you, everything I've said, you already knew. You knew more than me. You know more than me about her. I think everybody, we're all in agreement. This is something to appreciate. But I think it's something more. Because not just to come here tonight to honour her children, whom obviously people have enormous respect for, but the connection doesn't end simply because somebody passed away. Wouldn't it be wonderful, just like those art students in the Louvre, to copy, to take an element of that technique, that brushstroke, that thickness of paint, that perspective, to render that work of art? Wouldn't it be wonderful to take an element on Joyce's first yard side, take an element of what we've talked about and say, yeah, I'm going to do that. Things we've all had in our life, tough times. Wouldn't it be good to turn that from being not just sympathy for people like that, but empathy? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be proactive, to go out there and, because I know what you're going through, help you through that. Wouldn't it be wonderful to take all her chesed and the open house and the smiles and looking after other people and volunteering, just everything we said, and become, as it were, the pupil studying the master, or in this case the mistress? Wouldn't that be a wonderful way to honor a wonderful person on her first yortzeit, where we can stand back and see the candles, to go away tonight and just say, no, it was nice to go there and to remember her, but I want to take something that we reminded ourselves tonight about her and do something. And the next week, straight away, make a commitment. A little bit more chesed. Those Jewish values that she took to so much. We heard about the shiur that Nicole will have here on this night every week. That'd be a nice thing. Come back and do a bit of Jewish learning. Strengthen that Jewish stayingness when so many were leaving. Looking after people who are like you, in your situation. Could be a better way of honouring the memory of somebody who really produced a life. It was a masterpiece. Truly. Every Jew is. Not every Jew gets to show it. Joyce did. And therefore, I think we should all share in that beautiful life and that beautiful picture we've seen tonight. Take a bit of it. Paint our own little miniatures, our own copies. And there'll be no better way than to honour that artist and to take the brushstroke and start painting just the way she did.